The injured Felix Walker later wrote down in his journal, and I quote, "Such a sight some of us had never saw before, nor perhaps will never see again." It's hard to imagine that here in Kentucky that there was 200 buffalo just running around the area and all the wildlife. But Kentucky was known as a gem for not only wildlife, but also all kinds of resources. And that's one of the reasons why there was such a fight between white and red men for the area of Kentucky. The area that Daniel Boone and Axmen chose to build the fort was right here at the mouth of Otter Creek. Very near Otter Creek is a ford that in low water you could actually cross over the Kentucky River. Also, there was a really nice salt lick that was there that would attract game, and there was several natural springs in the area, making it a great place to settle. The men immediately started building crude shelters, makeshift places for them to start being able to build the fort. They started cutting logs and such. 19 days later, on April the 20th, 1775, Colonel Henderson and the rest of the party of settlers of the Transylvania Company arrived on location. Colonel Henderson saw the area down here in the low-lying Sycamore Hollow that the men had started to build the fort and said, "Guys, I don't think this is a good spot. I think we need to move it to the higher ground because this area is prone to flooding." So they moved the area to about 300 yards up on top of the hill to build the fort, which is where we're standing right now. Now, when I first read that story years ago, the first thing that came to my mind is back to my Marine Corps days. Those in the military can understand when your gunnery sergeant or your chief or your sergeant first class has led the advance party, done all the work, started to set up camp and things like that, and a little later the lieutenant or the captain shows up and says, I don't think this is a good spot. Let's move it just right over there. So I'm sure Colonel Henderson was correct in his assessment of moving the area, but it's just a neat little story that I thought about. So the men set up and immediately started building the fort, and the rest of that part is history. A few years later, in September of 1778, was the siege of Fort Boonesborough. Many of you know that Daniel Boone had been captured by the Shawnee before, and he spent about 8 or 10 months up in an area near modern-day Chillicothe, Ohio. He was actually adopted by Chief Blackfish as one of his own sons, nicknamed him Chautauqua, or gave him the Indian name of Chautauqua. Daniel had heard that the Indians were going to attack the fort and ran 4 days all the way back to the fort to give the alarm. That's, as the crow flies, that's about 120 miles if you make a straight line. That's quite a feat. Before the Indians attacked, Daniel convinced them to have a powwow, have a meeting about have negotiations about the siege. That negotiations happened right there in that valley right there in Sycamore Hollow. Daniel knew not to totally trust the Indians, so he told the men of the fort to beware and have some rifles trained on the situation. And of course, the negotiations did break down. There was a rifle crack from one of the Indians in the tree somewhere. Squire Boone was shot through the foot. Daniel he had to wrestle and scuffle with his adopted father, Chief Blackfish. But due to the men that were ready in the fort firing their weapons on the Indians, the men did escape back to the fort. And the fort was spared eventually after the siege. So anyway, I wanted to take you to this neat little spot here of Sycamore Hollow, which is ironically has a very similar name of Sycamore Shoals, where the Transylvania Company purchased Kentucky there in Tennessee, near Elizabethton, Tennessee. And we're here on the day that Daniel Boone arrived with his Axmen and started to build Fort Boonesborough and opening up the west past the Allegheny Mountains. And hey, remember, family tree nuts. Let our nuts find the nuts in your family tree.